The wind had not yet begun its usual Colorado tantrum outside, but inside the parlor of the Mercer Lodge, thunder had already broken loose. The room smelled of oilcloth, pipe smoke, and wood worn shiny by generations of command. A low fire stuttered in the hearth. A crystal decanter sat full and untouched on the sideboard, the amber whiskey inside trembling like a held breath. Over the mantel, the portrait of the man who had raised this empire watched with stern, painted eyes, the same eyes that seemed to glare from the older man actually pacing the floor. Silas Mercer, cattle baron of 3 counties, stood by the tall window, watching dusk pool across rolling pasture. 1,000 heads of cattle dotted the hills in little dark commas. His cattle, his name on the brands, his ledger inked into the land. His shoulders were broad from a lifetime of work, but his face had been chiseled into a ledger's hardness, a heart-grown iron under the relentless counting of acres and profit. Behind him, like a shadow that had outlived the sunset, stood Jonah Mercer, hat in hand, boots still splattered with mud, jaw set. He had learned the art of holding his tongue the way a field learns frost, without complaint, because it simply was what happened when seasons turned. Until tonight, he had swallowed his father's orders as he'd been taught, quiet, dutiful, obedient. "You think this is some romantic folly?" Silas said without turning. His voice carried the flat certainty of a judge. He struck a match, cupped its tiny flame, then lit his cigar with a flick of familiarity. "You'll marry her? Beauty doesn't matter. Feeling doesn't matter. You'll take the veil name and the deed and fold it into ours. That's final." Jonah blinked. His mouth opened slightly and closed again. He hadn't even claimed to have met her. He hadn't asked if she was lovely or plain. He had only hoped, foolishly, that the thing his father demanded might pass without stealing everything that still felt like hope. Silas turned then, a single predatory look that carried more history than any sermon. "You got something to say, or are you waiting for a prettier reason?" he barked. Jonah's voice came softer than defiance, edged with a curiosity that surprised even him. "Is she ugly?" he asked, and the question hung between them like a dare and a confession at once. Silas's mouth curved into something like amusement and contempt. "Your eyes don't need to eat, boy," he said. "Your legacy does." He poured himself a drink, left it on the table untouched, and settled in his leather chair like a man sealing an auction. "Marry her, give her your name, take the land, or walk out. Don't come back." No names had been spoken, only the kind of command Silas believed men followed without questions. Yet Jonah did not answer. The order tasted like cold iron in his mouth. He had swallowed far worse. He had learned, in 26 years, that his father meant what he said. The Vale place lay a day's riding north, a 300-acre strip of stubborn soil and stone that Silas had coveted for as long as Jonah could remember. The Vale family had been whittled to its last branch after a cruel winter of fever and loss. The daughter, Adelaide Vale, held the deed now, the last of her line, the last name that would carry those particular fields if she did not marry. "If you refuse," Silas said, voice lowering to a menace, "I'll ride you right off the property tonight. I don't raise men who let sentiment get in the way of keeping what 3 generations died for." Jonah felt the threat like a fist pressed to his ribs. He knew Silas well enough to know the price of displeasure. The room seemed smaller, as if the portraits themselves leaned in to watch which son would yield. 2 days later, rain began to stitch the sky. Jonah rode up the Vale Lane with a saddlebag of clean shirts and a Bible his mother had pressed into his hands, a relic of the faith he had once hoped marriage might reflect. The house stood low on the hill, paint peeled from the shutters, porch sagging like a bowed shoulder. It was not picturesque, it was honest. It had held winters and funerals, pies and prayers, stubbornness and sorrow. Adelaide opened the door before Jonah could knock. She wore a dress the color of worn slate. Her hair was tied back in a knot, practical enough to keep wind and work away. She was not the kind men set songs to. She was a woman cut from usefulness, solid, direct, eyes clear as spring water that registered a man's hands and not his manners. "You must be Jonah Mercer," she said, voice steady and unilluminated by welcome. "Young Mrs. Vale," he managed, tipping his hat out of habit he could no longer feel. He'd expected tears, pleas, maybe fury. He found instead a businesslike calm that made him feel unmoored. You can drop the titles, she said. We both know the reason you're here. Reverend Hargreaves arrives at 2. Coffee or whiskey? There was no trembling, no pleading, only a hand extended to offer him a seat and the quiet dignity of someone who had survived her fair share of storms. Inside, the house smelled faintly of lavender soap and dry dust. Sheets draped the furniture like sleepy ghosts. Portraits of previous veils in stern collars and frontier aprons lined the narrow hallway. Generations who had bent to the land and been broken soft by it. Adelaide moved with an unromantic grace, pouring coffee from a chipped blue pot. She placed the mug before him with a nod. You could have said no, she said, once coffee had warmed Jonah's hands and tinctured his courage. So could you, he replied hoarsely. The truth lodged in his throat like gravel. His boots were still saddled. It would have been easy to ride away into a narrower, smaller life, but ease and honor rarely came to the same table. No, Adelaide's fingers tightened around her cup. For the first time, Jonah saw a vulnerability beneath the practical surface. Not pleading, but fragile protective fury. This land is all that binds me to the past. A woman alone doesn't keep property long. Men like your father circle like vultures. I can't let them take what my grandparents bled for. The accusation stung because it was true. Silas had watched the Vale fields for years, waiting for some break in the line. Jonah's jaw clenched. I'm not my father, he said softly. Adelaide studied him like a hand testing soil. Maybe not, but you're still here. At 2 on the dot, Reverend Hargreaves, gentle, gray-browed, and tight, with the careful empathy of a man who had married more ranching families than he'd been able to count, stood in the front room. The ceremony lasted 7 minutes. No music, no bridal party, vows that hardly landed. Adelaide wore a hurried alteration of an old wedding dress. Jonah wore his Sunday suit and a face like a man walking to his own verdict. They signed the papers, accepted the Reverend's ceremonial handclasp, and became legally bound. After the hollow ritual, they stood side by side in a house that was, for the moment, colder, the way 2 strangers stand next to a casket and pretend the person inside still breathes. Jonah took the spare room upstairs. Adelaide told him supper would be at 6. Her voice had the same practical cadence as when she'd offered him a coffee. Businesslike, efficient, closed. Those first weeks were a choreography of distance. Dawn chores before words, separate work across the day. A dinner table where the weather, feed costs, and fence posts did the talking. They lived like 2 people who shared shelter, but not trust. It was a brittle peace, safe, predictable, isolating. Then fire cut through the night. Jonah woke to smoke and the war cry of agitated horses. He was pulling on boots before fear fully arranged itself. Beyond the window, a line of flame rode the dry grass like a living thing, greedy and fast. The barn, winter hay, tools, years of accumulated usefulness was in the fire's appetite. Heat rose like a thing coming to meet them. Jonah called Adelaide's name like a prayer and found her already halfway dressed, hair jammed under a working hat. Expression stripped to practical terror. They fought inside their roles and outside them. Words were few and actions many. Jonah cut fence wires, drove the herd toward the creek where the land held moisture, while Adelaide dug trenches and hauled water with a force of will that bruised the palms. They worked side by side with the efficiency of those who understood what losing everything felt like and would not be ruled by it. When dawn came, half the pasture was black and the barn was gray tooth and ash. The house, pounded by water and grit, stood. Most of the animals lived. Both of them were sooty and blistered and breathing as if they had run for a new life. Thank you, Adelaide said later, voice small. For what? Jonah asked. For staying, she replied, looking at him as if seeing him anew. It would have been easy to run. It was easy to stay, he said, and realized the truth of it as he said it. Because this is my home now, too. She squeezed his hand, briefly, almost shyly. A small, careful spark among the ruins. It meant nothing dramatic in that moment. It mattered like a seed in winter, a small promise stored for spring. The county fair arrived like a bright, brash healing. Adelaide planned not to go. Facing the town's quiet judgments, now that she bore the Mercer name, felt like walking a plank. But Jonah asked, no command, no old habit. He asked, You ever see a prize bull up close? He said. shifting his weight in a way that looked more like nervousness than courting. She accepted the invitation. They walked Main Street shoulder to shoulder, her silk dress a small rebellion against gossiping tongues, his hand near enough to be protective without being possessive. People looked, faces shifted. Whispered claws tried to find purchase. Mrs. Lillian Crow, a woman whose smile hid teeth, drifted over near the cider booth like a vulture dressed for Sunday. "Marriage suits you?" she said, too sweet. Her eyes catalogued Adelaide with the merciless appraisal women in town kept for each other: material, worth, quality, threat. Jonah stepped forward without thinking, an edge of protection rounding his voice. "We'll be fine," he said. "We've been managing." The defense felt foreign on his tongue, but it mattered. Mrs. Crow's smile faltered. Adelaide's mouth turned into something almost like pride. The two of them, marriage by contract, marriage by compulsion, found unexpectedly the habit of being a unit, not lovers, not yet, but partners, allies. As winter closed, Jonah rode up to Silas's lodge to tell him what they had decided. The Vale land would stay with the Vales. Silas's face hardened the moment Jonah announced it. A man who had measured life by acres and inheritance could not comprehend a son who chose partnership over patrimony. "You'd turn your back on what I built," Silas barked. "You could have taken our name and our reach." "We're keeping it," Jonah said. "Adelaide and I. We're building our own." Silas's wrath was a low animal thing. He spoke of banks and rustlers and ruin, of legacy sacrificed at the altar of sentiment. Jonah felt a clear, awful freedom come with his words. He'd never been so frightened and so unburdened at once. He left his father's house lighter than he had in years, and the first step felt like stealing air back from a chokehold. Winter pressed the land hard. Snow carved the sky pale and judgmental. They rebuilt the barn, mended fences with hands that learned to work well together, and fed the cattle through the new cold. At the table at night, they swapped details of the day and found the small, honest pleasure of two people who appreciated one another's competence. The intimacy there was not a conflagration. It was a slow green of moss under stone, almost invisible until it covered everything. Silas, resentful and watchful, stayed away for a long stretch. Then one evening, a knock interrupted lamplight and bread. He stood on their porch like a storm front. Snow caught on his hat brim, bulk wrapped against cold. He brought with him not only frost, but a paper contract from men with the word railway stamped across its corporate shoulder. "They're surveying a line through this valley," Silas said. He set the paperwork on their table like a judge. Maps, figures, offers far larger than either of them had ever held. "Take the money," he suggested. "Start fresh. California, good weather, less fire." Adelaide's hand hovered above the paper like a falcon deciding whether to strike. She thought of the apple tree her mother had kept by the kitchen window through drought and hail, of pies made from stubborn harvests, of a house that held generations. "Sell and you carry them with you," she said quietly. "We'd leave this dirt, but we'd sleep with the knowledge that we let strangers tear up what our family bled for." They argued that night as two people who trusted one another enough to be brutally honest. The money was unimaginable. It could buy another life, less struggle, more ease. But the land held stories that did not belong to them alone. To sell was to cut a thread in a loom that had been woven for decades. They decided to fight. 3 days later, they rode to the survey crew. City men with measuring rods looked small against the vast horizon. Patterson, the lead surveyor, not the reverend, spoke in placating tones about eminent domain and public good. He tried the practiced patience of a man trained to negotiate. Adelaide answered with steady words. "You must prove public good in court. You must show there is no alternative that avoids our land. We will not concede without a fight." Patterson packed his instruments with a muttered assessment of intractability. He left thinking these were stubborn ranchers. He did not expect the solidity of the quiet resolve he'd just encountered. Jonah and Adelaide rode home, not triumphant, but clear-headed. The battle might come, and if it did, they would be ready. The months were a blur of preparation. Legal counsel, neighbors rallied to their side, petitions signed, testimony gathered. The town, which had once whispered about inconvenience and impropriety, now watched and whispered different stories. Some of admiration, some of a grudging respect that tastes like salt. And meanwhile, life stitched itself into the small domesticities they had stitched together by necessity and affection. Shared coffee that lasted longer than it needed to, a hand-picked ribbon tied around Adelaide's, risked by Jonah with awkward tenderness, the sleepy quiet contentment of a house that had 2 names on the mailbox and 2 hands on the plow. One evening, after a hearing ended in a temporary reprieve, Adelaide turned to Jonah in the yard as lantern light skimmed snow. "When this is over," she asked softly, "would you try being married for real? Not because a man told you to, not because of debt or land, but because you want to stand with me?" Jonah's laugh came like a sudden thaw. He thought of the nights of shared danger, the steady, quiet competence that had become his favorite view. He thought of his father's portrait and how its stare had softened, a little, with time. "We already are," he said, and meant it. The words felt humble and enormous together. They had not come with fireworks. They had come in the quiet proof of staying, through smoke, through frost, through the everyday architecture of life on the land. The railroad ultimately found another route. Progress, always hungry, graffitied the map elsewhere. Silas Mercer never entirely forgave his son. He said as much in curt words that did not mean everything he'd once thought. But the field belonged to the Vale family still. The apple tree kept bearing pie-sweet fruit, and the barn stood, full of hay and the smell of oil and work. Love, in that little house at the top of the lane, did not arrive as a sudden blaze or a dramatic declaration. It came in the way bread was passed without ceremony, in the careful repair of fence posts done side by side, in the habit of putting another's hand to comfort before daybreak. It was a slow thing, built by grit, faith, and a stubborn refusal to let what mattered be taken without a fight. They lived their days stitched by labor and tempered by shared triumphs. People in the county would tell the story, sometimes simplified, sometimes gilded, about the Mercers and the Vale place. But the truth of it belonged to those 2 who had chosen one another. A truth that said some loves are earned, some marriages forged in necessity are transformed by simple courage and constancy, and that some pieces of land are worth defending not only for what they provide, but for what they mean. If you enjoyed this tale and want more stories about love that grows the hard way, through fire, grit, and slow trust, please share this story with someone who loves historical, character-driven fiction. Leave a comment telling me which scene resonated with you most. Follow for more tales set on the wild edges of the American West.